Welcome to our Bible overview series in the True Vibes. Today, we begin with the first book of the Bible, Genesis. The word Genesis means beginnings. It tells us about the beginning of the universe, humankind, sin, and God's plan of redemption. And the beginning of nations, especially God's chosen nation, Israel. Genesis is not just history, it's the foundation of God's plan for humanity. It says in the Genesis chapter 12 to 1 to verse 3 where God tells Abraham, "I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." This promise points to God's plan to bring salvation to the whole world through Abraham's descendants. Have you ever thought why this book was written? First, beginning of the universe and humankind. Second, beginning of sin and God's redemption. Third, beginning of nations and God's chosen people, Israel. Purpose of the book of Genesis. 1. To illustrate how everything began, creation and humanity's fall. 2. To reveal God's covenant promises to Abraham and his descendants. 3. To explain how Israel ended up in Egypt, preparing for the book of Exodus. The book of Genesis covers a span of about 2,300 to 2,500 years of human history, more time than all the other books of the Bible combined. Book of Genesis has 50 chapters, and each tells a key part of God's unfolding plan from creation to Joseph in Egypt. Genesis is divided into two major sections. First, primeval history, chapters 1 to 11. This section focuses on four key events: creation, fall, flood, and nation spread. Second, patriarchal history, chapters 12 to 50. The beginning of God's chosen nation. This section focuses on four key people: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. Primeval history, Genesis chapter 1 to 11, first event, creation. Chapter 1 to 1 to chapter 2 to 3, creation of the world. God spoke the universe into existence in 6 days. Chapter 1 to verse 2 says, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters." Day 1, light, day and night. Day 2, sky, waters. Day 3, land, seas, and plants. Day 4, sun, moon, and stars. Day 5, birds and sea creatures. Day 6, land animals and humankind in his image. Chapter 2 to 4 to verse 25, creation of humankind. God formed the first man, Adam, from the dust of the ground and breathed into him the breath of life. He planted the Garden of Eden, filled with trees that were pleasant and good for food, including the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. God gave Adam the responsibility to care for the garden and commanded him not to eat from the forbidden tree. Seeing that Adam was alone, God created the first woman, Eve, from Adam's rib as a perfect helper and companion. On the seventh day, God rested and blessed it as holy. God is the creator of all things. Everything he made was good, and humanity is his special creation to reflect his image. Created for fellowship with God. Second event, fall. Fall of humankind. Genesis chapter 3 to 1 to verse 24 says, "The serpent tempted Eve to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which God had forbidden. Eve ate the fruit and gave some to Adam, and he also ate. Their eyes were opened, and they realized they were naked, so they hid from God. God confronted them, and because of their disobedience, the serpent was cursed to crawl on its belly. The woman would face pain in childbirth. The man would toil for food from the ground. They were banished from the Garden of Eden to prevent them from eating from the tree of life. Sin separates us from God. But in Genesis chapter 3:15, God promised a future Redeemer who would crush the serpent's head. It's about Jesus, the Redeemer of sin, and the Savior. Chapter 4 to 1 to verse 26, Cain and Abel. Cain kills his brother Abel out of jealousy. Cain kills his brother Abel, showing how sin spread through humanity. Third event, flood. Chapter 5:1 to verse 32 Descendants of Adam. Traces the genealogy from Adam to Noah. Chapter 6:1 to verse 22 Wicked humankind and righteous Noah. God grieves over humanity's wickedness but spares Noah, a righteous man. God warns of judgment, but Noah finds favor and builds the ark. Chapter 7:1 to verse 24 The Great Flood. The earth was filled with sin and violence, so God sent a flood to cleanse it. He told Noah, a righteous and obedient man, to build an ark to save his family and the animals. It rained for 40 days and 40 nights, and the waters covered even the mountains. Everything outside the ark perished. After 150 days, the waters receded, and the ark rested on Mount Ararat. A dove returned with an olive leaf, showing the land was drying. Chapter 8:1 to chapter 9:29 God's covenant with Noah. Noah built an altar to worship God. God promised never again to destroy the earth by flood and preserve the cycles of seasons. Noah's character. Noah was faithful, obedient, and blameless in his generation, trusting God even when others did not. Fourth event, nation spread. Chapter 10:1 to verse 32 Descendants of Noah's sons. After the flood, the chapter lists the families of Noah's 3 sons. Japheth's descendants spread across the coastlands and became the Gentile nations. Ham's descendants include Cush, Egypt, Canaan, and others who settled in Africa and parts of the Middle East. Shem's descendants became the ancestors of the Hebrews and many nations of the Near East. This chapter shows how all nations came from Noah's sons after the flood. Chapter 11:1 to verse 32 Tower of Babel, descendants of Shem. After the flood, the whole world spoke one language. People gathered in Shinar and decided to build a tower that reached the heavens to make a name for themselves. God saw their pride and confused their language, causing them to stop building and scatter across the earth. Chapter traces the family line from Shem, Noah's son, to Abraham. It shows how God chose a family line through whom he would bless the world. Abram's father, Terah, moved the family from Ur to Haran, preparing for God's call to Abram in Genesis chapter 12. Patriarchal history, Genesis chapter 12 to 50. This section focuses on 4 key people: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. First person. Abraham. Chapter 12:1 to verse 20 Call of Abram. God calls Abram to leave his homeland, promising to make him a great nation. Chapter 13:1 to chapter 14:24 Abram and Lot. Abram and Lot's herds grew so large they separated. Lot chose the fertile land near Sodom, while Abram stayed in Canaan. Later, Lot was captured in a war, but Abram rescued him with his trained men. Abram met Melchizedek, king of Salem, who blessed him. Chapter 15:1 to verse 21 God's covenant with Abram. God promised Abram countless descendants and the land of Canaan. Abram believed God, and it was counted as righteousness. God sealed the covenant with a sacrificial ceremony. Chapter 16:1 to verse 16 Hagar bore Ishmael. Sarai, unable to have children, gave her servant Hagar to Abram. Hagar conceived Ishmael but fled due to mistreatment. The angel of the Lord told her to return and promised Ishmael would become a great nation. Chapter 17:1 to chapter 18:15 Covenant reminded. God renewed his covenant with Abram, changed his name to Abraham and Sarai to Sarah, and gave circumcision as a sign. God promised they would have a son, Isaac, though they were old. Sarah laughed at the news. Chapter 18:16 to chapter 19:38 Judgment on Sodom and Gomorrah. God revealed his plan to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah for their wickedness. Abraham interceded, and God agreed to spare the cities for 10 righteous people, but none were found. God rescued Lot and his family, but his wife looked back and became a pillar of salt. The cities were destroyed by fire. Chapter 20 to 1 to verse 18 Abraham and Abimelech. Abraham said Sarah was his sister, so King Abimelech took her. God warned Abimelech in a dream. He returned Sarah unharmed. God protected Sarah, and Abimelech's household was healed. Chapter 21 to 1 to verse 34 Birth of Isaac. God fulfilled his promise. Sarah gave birth to Isaac. Hagar and Ishmael were sent away, but God cared for them. Abraham made a peace treaty with Abimelech at Beersheba. Chapter 22 to 1 to verse 24 Test of faith. God tested Abraham by asking him to sacrifice Isaac. Abraham obeyed, but God stopped him and provided a ram instead. God reaffirmed his blessing and promises to Abraham's descendants. Chapter 23 to 1 to verse 20 Death of Sarah. Sarah died in Hebron at 127 years old. Abraham bought the cave of Machpelah as a burial site, securing the first piece of the promised land. Character of Abraham. Faithful, obedient, a friend of God. He teaches us about faith and trust in God's promises. Second person. Isaac. Chapter 24 to 1 to verse 67 Isaac marries Rebekah. Abraham's servant prayed for guidance to find a wife for Isaac. God led him to Rebekah, who showed kindness by giving water. She agreed to go with him, and Isaac married Rebekah, fulfilling God's promise. Chapter 25 to 1 to verse 18 Death of Abraham. He died at 175 years old and was buried with Sarah in the cave of Machpelah. The chapter also records the descendants of Ishmael. Chapter 26 to 1 to verse 35 Isaac and Abimelech. During a famine, God told Isaac to stay in Gerar and reaffirmed his covenant. Isaac said Rebekah was his sister, but Abimelech discovered the truth. God blessed Isaac with great wealth, leading to conflict over wells, but peace was made. Character of Isaac. Quiet, peaceful, obedient to God and his parents. He represents patience and submission to God's will. Third person. Jacob. Chapter 27 to 1 to chapter 28 to 22 Jacob cheated Esau and flees. Jacob, guided by his mother Rebekah, deceived Isaac to receive Esau's blessing. Esau grew angry. So Jacob fled to Haran. On the way, Jacob dreamed of a ladder reaching to heaven, and God reaffirmed his covenant promise. Chapter 29 to 1 to verse 30 Jacob marries Laban's daughters. Jacob loved Rachel and worked 7 years to marry her, but Laban deceived him and gave Leah first. Jacob then married Rachel too, working another 7 years. Chapter 29 to 31 to chapter 30 to 24 Jacob's sons God blessed Leah with sons. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah. Rachel, still childless, gave her maid Bilhah, who bore Dan and Naphtali. Leah's maid Zilpah bore Gad and Asher. Leah later had Issachar and Zebulun, and a daughter Dinah. Finally, God opened Rachel's womb, and she bore Joseph. Chapter 30 to 25 to verse 43 Jacob prospers. Jacob asked Laban to let him return home but agreed to keep the speckled and spotted livestock as wages. Through God's blessing, Jacob's flocks increased greatly, and he became very wealthy. Chapter 31 to 1 to verse 55 Jacob flees from Laban. God told Jacob to return to his homeland. Jacob secretly left Laban's house with his family and flocks. Laban pursued him, but God warned Laban in a dream. They made a peace covenant and parted in peace. Chapter 32 to 1 to verse 32 Jacob becomes Israel. Fearing Esau, Jacob prayed for God's protection. That night, Jacob wrestled with a divine being who blessed him and changed his name to Israel, meaning, one who struggles with God. Chapter 33 to 1 to verse 20 Jacob meets Esau. Jacob humbly approached Esau, fearing revenge, but Esau forgave him, and they reconciled. Jacob settled near Shechem and built an altar to God. Chapter 34 to 1 to verse 31 Revenge for Dinah. Dinah, Jacob's daughter, was violated by Shechem, who wanted to marry her. Her brothers Simeon and Levi deceived the men of the city and killed them in revenge, bringing trouble to Jacob's family. Chapter 35 to 1 to verse 29 God's promise to Jacob. God told Jacob to return to Bethel, where God reaffirmed his covenant promise and blessed him. Jacob's name was again confirmed as Israel. Rachel died giving birth to Benjamin, and later, Isaac died at the age of 180. Chapter 36 to 1 to verse 43 Descendants of Esau. This chapter lists the family line of Esau, Edom, detailing his wives, sons, chiefs, and kings who settled in the hill country of Seir. Character of Jacob. Ambitious, sometimes deceitful, yet transformed by God. He shows that God's grace can change flawed people into leaders of faith. Fourth person, Joseph. Chapter 37 to 1 to verse 36 Joseph betrayed. Joseph, Jacob's favorite son, received a coat of many colors and shared his dreams of greatness, angering his brothers. They sold him to Ishmaelite traders, who took him to Egypt, and they deceived Jacob into thinking Joseph was dead. Chapter 38 to 1 to verse 30 Judah and Tamar. Judah's sons died. Chapter 39 to 1 to verse 23 Joseph in Potiphar's house. Joseph served in Potiphar's house and God blessed all he did. Potiphar's wife falsely accused him, and Joseph was thrown into prison, but God's favor remained with him. Chapter 40 to 1 to verse 23 Joseph interprets prisoners' dreams. In prison, Joseph interpreted the dreams of Pharaoh's cupbearer and baker. The cupbearer would be restored, and the baker would be executed. The cupbearer was restored but forgot Joseph. Chapter 41 to 1 to verse 57 Joseph interprets Pharaoh's dream. Pharaoh dreamed of 7 fat cows and thin cows, and 7 healthy and scorched heads of grain. Joseph interpreted it as 7 years of plenty followed by 7 years of famine. Pharaoh made Joseph governor of Egypt, and Joseph stored grain to save many lives. Chapter 42 to 1 to verse 38 Famine. Brothers come to Egypt. During the famine, Jacob sent his sons to buy grain in Egypt, where they unknowingly met Joseph. Joseph accused them of being spies and kept Simeon in prison, demanding they return with Benjamin. Chapter 43 to 1 to chapter 44 to 34 Brothers come again with Benjamin. The famine continued, so the brothers returned to Egypt with Benjamin. Joseph welcomed them kindly but secretly tested them by placing his silver cup in Benjamin's sack. Judah pleaded to take Benjamin's place, showing changed hearts. Chapter 45 to 1 to verse 28 Joseph reveals himself to his brothers. Joseph revealed his identity to his brothers and forgave them, saying God had sent him ahead to save lives during the famine. He invited his family to live in Egypt, and the brothers returned to tell Jacob that Joseph was alive. Chapter 46 to 1 to verse 34 Jacob travels to Egypt. God reassured Jacob to go to Egypt, promising to make his family a great nation there. Jacob moved with all his descendants, totaling 70 family members. Chapter 47 to 1 to verse 31 Jacob's family settled in Goshen. Pharaoh welcomed Jacob's family and gave them the land of Goshen to live in. The famine worsened, and Joseph managed Egypt's grain and land wisely. Jacob blessed Pharaoh and lived in Egypt for 17 years. Chapter 48 to 1 to chapter 49 to 33 Jacob blesses his children. Jacob blessed Joseph's sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, giving the younger Ephraim the greater blessing. Before dying, Jacob blessed each of his 12 sons, speaking prophecies about their future tribes. Jacob requested to be buried in Canaan with his fathers. 50 to 1 to verse 26 Jacob buried in Joseph's death. After Jacob dies, he is buried in Canaan. Joseph forgives his brothers, lives a long life in Egypt, and asks that his bones be carried to Canaan when God delivers his people. Character of Joseph. Faithful, forgiving, wise, resilient. He teaches us about forgiveness, God's providence, and endurance in trials. Genesis narrates how God created everything and how sin entered the world. It introduces God's promise to redeem humanity through a chosen family, the line of Abraham. It explains how Israel ended up in Egypt, setting the stage for events in Exodus. This is the story of beginnings, of creation, humanity, sin, and redemption. Genesis reminds us that God is faithful to his promises and always at work to bless all nations. And also, we see God's character clearly revealed. He is the creator of all things, sovereign over history, holy and just, yet merciful and compassionate. Through his promises to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, we witness his faithfulness across generations. The timeless truths from Genesis remind us that God is always in control, that faith and obedience bring blessings, and that even in our failures, his mercy and purpose prevail. No matter what we face, God's promises are trustworthy, and his plan is perfect. So, let Genesis inspire you to trust God, walk in faith, and remember that he is always at work in your life, just as he was in the lives of his people long ago. If this message encouraged you, hit the like button, subscribe for more biblical insights, and share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear how God's Word is speaking to you. Join us in the next episode as we explore the book of Exodus, where we'll witness God's mighty hand deliver his people from Egypt.